Here in studio by Tom White. Tom, the market all over the place as it has been, but right now we got some strength here in the equities. So I think for now, we'll set that to the side and let's talk a part of the market that it has really caught my intrigue, which is the sports betting and wagering side of the market. I know it's caught LikeFolio's intrigue as well. Joining us from LikeFolio.com is the VP of Research, Megan Brantley, and of course, Jenny Horn with us as well, TD Ameritrade Network contributor, and my co-host here on Next Gen Investing coming up. Jenny, how about you kick it off? Because this is a very, very interesting space, one that we talk about quite often, but it's interesting to me because it's a legacy existing business that's being disrupted by all these new players.
Yes, and first of all, Alex, I have to echo your excitement for Next Gen Investing, which will be, of course, Monday. We've worked very hard on this, and this topic actually is perfect. You know, DraftKings is one of these sort of trendy names that has sort of risen to relevance over the last year, as well as Penn National. But there's so many players in this space, and that's actually a bit of a concern for me. I mean, you have DraftKings, Penn National, MGM, Caesars, FuboTV, I mean, just to name a few. So this space is getting very crowded because I think so many companies sort of saw the success that was DraftKings after its IPO. Now, these companies operate in daily sports betting. They also develop software for online sports betting. They sort of have their hands in many different parts of this market. But collectively, they sort of slid over the last few months. DraftKings has slid over 10% alone in the last 7 sessions, now rising today. Penn National has almost halved its valuation over the last few months. So they have seen this degree of pullback as of recently. But I actually saw a really interesting report from Bank of America that after they released their August data for sort of this U.S. online sports gaming, and it found that DraftKings and Flutter Entertainment, which is FanDuel, are dominating the country's largest sports betting markets. So BofA actually estimated that U.S. digital gross gaming revenue was about $412 million, which was up almost 90% from last year, but down from July. Now, the analysts went on to say this is not typically a surprise because historically they do see lower sports betting interest in the month of August, so keep that in mind. But what I thought was just interesting about this report is it named the top betting states being New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, and said that FanDuel is actually the clear leader. FanDuel actually captures about 40% of the total online sports betting market share, which surprised me. DraftKings comes in a close second at about 29% market share. Following that is MGM Resorts, and lastly, or fourth, I guess you'd say, is then Penn, which of course has its Barstool Sportsbook, which only has about 5% of the addressable market. So you could argue that then Penn has room to grow, but I just think it's important to keep in mind that Penn operates still the bulk of their business with these traditional, slot machines. So they are less exposed to this online sports betting market than, say, a DraftKings is. But really, when looking at these two names, they're often compared, and social media is really, really excited about these names and just the developments. And of course, we're still yet to get legalization on so many states when it comes to online sports betting. But I thought it was interesting the way we're so often comparing Penn to DraftKings when really Penn has a huge part of its business that DraftKings does not. So that actually brings me to our first tweeter of the day, which sort of highlights Penn, which says, Penn National weekly update, good recovery this week after market gap down, and DraftKings dragging this name down with their buyout of another online sports betting company. I'm extremely biased towards this because of Barstool, but should learn to trade better. Traded this from $30 last year. Now that was, of course, DraftKings has proposed an offer for Entain, which is a UK sports betting operator, which would give it actually access to several more countries. So if that deal went through for DraftKings, that would, of course, be huge. But I just think that's a really good point that Barstool sort of holds its own relevance. But again, that is just one tiny piece of Penn, something to keep in mind when potentially trading that stock. But our next tweet today sort of focuses on both because, again, this comparison is all over Twitter this morning, which says, I've always said I like both and that they'd both be two of the top 4 to 5 to make it long term. But of the two, I like Penn more. One half of the market cap of DraftKings, lower CAC, profitable, and casinos. I believe both could reach a $40 billion market cap in 12 to 18 months, though. So I like that they highlighted sort of the strong case for both of these names, but it is interesting when you consider that DraftKings, again, has more of this sports betting exposure. Penn has more of this traditional gaming exposure. So, Megan, I am so excited to see what your data says because, again, there's so many players actually just even beyond these two in this space. FanDuel, FuboTV, I mean, the list could just go on and on.
Yeah, it was really interesting. We were looking at this and we were trying to determine, what companies do we put on this scatter plot to compare, because they're all a little bit different, as a lot of these tweeters have highlighted. But one thing that I think is really significant is that for DraftKings and for Penn specifically, they had quarters that just ended on September 30th. And so that was yesterday. This is a big day for us internally, because that's when we look and say, okay, now that this quarter is completed and we have, this full data set, what is it looking like? What are our earnings scores looking like? And DraftKings and Penn both had two of the highest earnings scores that we track comparatively. They were about 55 and 59. And so obviously we have some time until those companies actually report on those earnings. But that does give us what we think is a bit of an edge, because as you mentioned, there has been a bit of a pullback of late. So this scatter plot chart, though, this shows all of the different players that you've touched on. And I think it's clear, key takeaways. You've got DraftKings and FanDuel. These are the largest players. The size of that circle is the total mention volume. So you can see those are the biggest circles on this chart. They're both still growing, which is good. And they both still have, their sentiment is about in line with DraftKings edging out FanDuel just a little bit in our data. But definitely FanDuel having the largest overall circle if you really drill down. But then you have these other outliers. You have the Penns of the world that have such high happiness driven by this content that Barstool provides. And then you have Fubo, who's kind of an outlier. This is more of a streaming service, but they are launching a sports betting app and an online gaming app. And so they're a relevant and potential disruptor in this space that we've got a close eye on, because as you can see, they're to the far right of this chart. Their growth is almost exponential at this point.
Yeah, and Megan, if you take a look at that, and you guys mentioned DraftKings and FanDuel are the two top players in this space. Penn's making inroads based on their Barstool, investment there, where they own a portion of Barstool. It's almost like free advertising for them. But if you look at that, is it starting to trend down? Maybe some of the mentions and some of the positive data that you guys have seen from the two leaders, because I believe DraftKings just overtook FanDuel and app downloads on the Apple iOS, and Penn and Fubo starting to get into the space. Are you starting to see the old legacy leaders start to wane a little bit as far as sentiment goes?
I think it's telling that with the higher volume, they tend to have a lower sentiment level, just in general. But overall, the fact that we're still able to see these names grow with the size that they've already kind of commanded, I think is pretty impressive. And that's what our earnings scores reflect. Earnings scores of 55 and 59, those are pretty high, because our scores go from about a positive 100 to a negative 100. So whenever we see things like that, that tells us that they're still growing at a nice rate, for sure. But I do think it is relevant to continue watching these names like Penn and these names like Fubo, because as Jenny mentioned, there are so many options for consumers. And at the end of the day, I think it comes down to, from a consumer perspective, what is the easiest way to engage? What is the most natural way for you to engage? Which app is providing the most positive experience? And so far, I think Penn does have a slight edge there, just in the fact that users like to engage with Penn and they like the added content that Penn provides.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really strong point, Megan. The association with Barstool, there's the content element, there's the personality element, and there's clearly a loyalty element to this as well. When you see a 80% happiness versus the low to mid 60s, there's clearly something different going on there. But it also maybe shows that it's a little bit more niche. They're going to target maybe a smaller portion of this market, but they're going to do really, really well to engage that smaller market. As for the companies like DraftKings and FanDuel, it really does seem that there's been this first-to-market advantage for both of these companies, as they were able to roll out first the daily fantasy sports, and that kind of helped this legalization hurdle that these companies face. But it gave them kind of the relationship and the infrastructure through the technology that maybe gave them a leg up on companies like MGM or Caesars Palace or Las Vegas Sands. And these companies that, in my analogy, are kind of like the taxi service, and then the Ubers and the Lyfts, or the FanDuel and the DraftKings. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I don't know that I would consider or even know how to engage with an MGM or something like that if I'm not in Vegas, participating somewhere in person. But something like a DraftKings or an app that I can download on my phone, or something that I can engage with while I'm watching a game from home, or, from somewhere that's not in a casino. I think that that's a really strong potential adoption point for names like DraftKings, for names even like FuboTV, that, they want to apply and integrate this betting inside of this live TV component. I think that that could be potentially really powerful because it makes it easier for a user to engage and definitely expand your potential audience.
No, completely agree with you, Megan. I think that's the ultimate bet, I guess, that Fubo is making, is that they are going to be able to disrupt and offer something that's intriguing to the consumer and maybe earns them some loyalty as well. I think the jury's still out, but I'm excited to watch that develop as well. Thanks to Megan Brantley, as always, for joining us, VP of Research at LikeFolio.com. Have a great weekend. And thanks to Jenny Horn as well, TD Ameritrade Network contributor, and my future